I genuinely, full-heartedly love Marvel Snap. There's a lot that's special about Marvel Snap, but if I was forced to pick two things that I like the most, it's the cube/retreat/snap system that I'll collectively just call the cube system, and the especially unique approach to individual card design. Sadly, in the live version of the game right now, both of these two things are temporarily limited. After you hit infinite, cubes mean a lot less, meaning retreating happens a lot less, meaning that snapping means almost nothing. That's a temporary problem because they're working on their tournament mode or competitive mode or whatever they're going to call it, and that's going to be our competitive environment. So after we hit infinite, we're going to just go on to that game mode for our competitive experience rather than the ladder. So that I'm not concerned about. They're going to fix that in the long run. And I already have every card in the game, so I don't get to experiment with new cards anywhere near as often as everybody else, because I've already experimented with all 174 cards plenty of times. And to be clear, that's not a complaint. Okay, there's a reason I've experienced all 174 of those cards. It's because I love this game and I love each and every one of those individual cards. And the team over at Second Dinner has gone out of their way to explicitly state that their goal in the end, once they have all of their systems in place, is to release one card a week. That's going to make me super happy once that is in place because it gives me a new reason to make a new deck every single week. That sounds perfect. But those systems that Second Dinner is talking about aren't in place yet, which is understandable. We're in an early beta period. They just talked about how they have to dramatically overhaul their monetization plan, so we as a community of players have to be patient and give that team time to come up with the best possible replacement for those systems to get new cards into the game. I say that we have to give them time, but I'm an exceptionally impatient person, so I went out of my way to build the entire game inside of Tabletop Simulator in order to play games with friends and to play with unreleased cards. So, let's talk about that. Tabletop Simulator is a game on Steam built for recreating tabletop or physical games in a digital environment. You can play pretty much any tabletop game you can think of on Tabletop Simulator. There are some awesome, incredible, modern tabletop games on Tabletop Simulator. If you've never played any modern tabletop games, or even older tabletop games, let me recommend you some. The DC deck building game is exceptionally fun in a group of friends. Marvel Champions is a fun co-op experience that can be played solo as well, so if you don't have any friends that are interested in tabletop games, you can try that one out all on your own, but it will take some time because you're gonna have to read the rulebook. It is really fun, I promise. And a personal favorite of mine is Dice Throne, and they actually recently added 8 new Marvel characters to the game. You can even build your very own tabletop games on Tabletop Simulator, though this requires a lot of work. You might be wondering, how does this app actually work? Well, it's actually fairly simple. It's a pretty basic sandbox of physics. Everything is just assets that you can plug in yourself. Everything operates as though it would in a physical environment, so there's no background scripting or programming, though you can implement advanced scripting objects. For example, take a look at this Pokemon table that somebody made. I won't go into the details of the rules of this game, but you can just tell looking at it how complicated this is, and there's a lot of background programming that goes into making this table work the way it does. It summons in 3D models, it keeps track of health, all of that's done automatically and completely goes over my head because my programming experience is incredibly limited, so I won't be able to make anything like this, but that's okay. That's a very, very advanced table. We're not trying to make anything like that. For the most part, Tabletop Simulator is just a physics object engine that you plug your own objects into. Because of that, you can imagine quite a few issues come up with importing Marvel Snap into Tabletop Simulator. Before I discuss the issues that came up when I was importing Marvel Snap into Tabletop Simulator, I want to highlight 2 community members who have already done a similar project. Fergus Bentley and Synchrochamp posted a Tabletop Simulator mod on the Steam Workshop, but it didn't have everything I wanted and didn't have an answer for synchronous gameplay. It's based on the original patch of the game, meaning that Nova still has +2 power, for example, and it doesn't have any of the unreleased cards. So instead of asking them if I could modify their table in some way, I just got to work and started making my own. First, I needed .png images of every single card in the game. I reached out to Mr. Metal because I know he did a tier list on tiermaker.com, so I knew he had access to all of the .pngs, but then he dono-walled me for 3 days, so unlucky. But once I managed to collect all of those assets, I had to import them directly into Tabletop Simulator. Then you might wonder, but Willow, how did we actually get text on each of these cards? That is a fantastic question. At this point, I'm basically presented with 2 different options. I can either individually Photoshop all 174 cards to include their text on the image itself, or I could use a different solution instead, one that's inside of Tabletop Simulator itself. So instead of going for the option that would basically add 10+ hours to this project, I went with the solution that's inside of Tabletop Simulator. Tabletop Tabletop Simulator has two different text options on individual objects, the quote-unquote name of the object and then the description of the object. So, pretty simple, right? Just put the name of the card on the name and the ability of the card in the description. Makes perfect sense. Well, that's basically what I did, but I switched it around actually. I put the name of the card in the description box and I put the description of the card in the name box. This is because when you hover over an object with your mouse, the game will show you the name of the object first, and then if you continue to hover over the same object, it will eventually show you the description. But because the name of the card is already on the card in Marvel Snap, you can already see the logo of the card, so you can already see the name. I figured the name was significantly less important information than what the ability of the card itself did. So if you look at any of the objects that I've imported here, none of them actually have the name of the card in the name section. It just has the ability of the card, but you can hover over the card for a longer period of time to actually see the name of the card. I know we said name and ability a lot there, but basically, I just switched everything around to make it look nicer. Sorry if that was hard to follow. So, after manually writing down every single character name and ability in the game, I had to repeat this process for every unreleased card as well. Because what's the point of free time if you don't waste it doing something like this? While I was importing every single card, I was trying to think of how we could solve individual card effects, because some card effects are going to be harder to resolve than others. For example, what about Agent 13? Well, Agent 13 was actually more simple than you might think. Tabletop Simulator has a built-in system called states. Without going into too much detail about how these work, basically I set aside a copy of Agent 13 and then I gave her 2 extra states. So while you play the card Agent 13, all you have to do is create a copy of it, right-click on the card, and then switch the card to its second state. The second state is just a pile of every card in the game, so now you have a pool of cards to pull from with your Agent 13 effect. Now, while I showed you that, you might have also noticed that the card has a third state. This third state is optional and doesn't have to be used, but it includes every unreleased card as well. So basically you would decide before the game starts whether or not you're using the unreleased pool of cards as well, then you would switch to the third state when you activate Agent 13's effect to also pull from that pool of cards. I had to repeat this process for every card generation effect in the game, so Squirrel Girl, Mr. Sinister, Brood, those types of things. Then there are card effects that target your deck, so for example, Okoye or Mr. Negative. For the person actually playing this card, it's relatively straightforward. All you have to do is when you draw the card, you can rotate it halfway, so that way you know, hey, this card's rotated, that tells me this has been affected by another card effect. But because this is a 2-player game, you need some way to be able to verify to your opponent, hey, this is the card that was affected by Mr. Negative, or this is the card that was affected by Okoye. So in order to set up some form of verification process, what you need to do is when you play your Mr. Negative, or when you play your Okoye, create a copy of your deck and leave it face down and set it aside. Then create a copy of Okoye or Mr. Negative and put it on top of that pile. That way you know these are the cards that have been affected by that card. And that way at the end of the game, you can verify to your opponent, hey, look, this card was indeed affected by that card. And that way when you go to play one of those cards that have been affected by Mr. Negative or Okoye, you can simply show your opponent a copy from that pile that you made. But Willow, what happens when multiple effects affect a single card? For example, what if you played Okoye and Mr. Negative? I don't know why you would do that, but let's say, for example, you did. That is definitely more complicated, but it's still doable. Continue to create copies of your deck for verification purposes, but for your own clarity, instead of rotating the card even harder or something, add a comment to the card in the name of the card. This is to remember what effects actually applied to it. So let's say I had an inverted Iron Man in my hand that was also affected by Okoye. All I would do is right-click on it, go to where it says Iron Man, and then in brackets write Okoye and Mr. Negative. Easy. For any effects that choose random locations, like moving left to right on something like Strange Academy, we simply roll dice, and then the bottom 3 are left, and the top 3 numbers are right. For more complicated effects like Ironheart, we have a public random number generator tool created by a Tabletop Simulator user. I don't remember the name of that user. Give me one moment to look it up. Man, someone should have put this in their script, don't you think? The Tabletop Simulator user was Roach. I'm fairly certain, I don't actually know because we haven't done a ton of testing with this table, but I'm pretty sure I've accounted for every single effect in the game. There is a way to resolve it on this version of Tabletop Simulator, but instead of going over each of them, I'll mention one more, which is probably my favorite solution that we have, and that's Mysterio. Mysterio was also solved with the same state change system we talked about with Agent 13, but it's all just different copies of Mysterio. So the first state, the one that you draw, this just looks like Mysterio does when he's in your hand. As for the other two, one of them is the fake copy, and one of them is the real copy. You can only tell the difference between the two by holding your mouse over the copy of the card, and then eventually it will reveal itself as fake or real. This is because we've put the fake or real text in the name section of the asset, just like we talked about earlier in the video with some of the other asset stuff going on. There is a way for your opponent to cheat this, but they need a little bit of Tabletop Simulator knowledge, and hopefully if anybody's playing on this table, they should probably be trustworthy, because it's, you know, a private mod and all. At this point of creating the mod, I realized I didn't have any locations, so I basically repeated the same process for everything I've done up until this point, but with locations. The most annoying part about this was honestly that the location assets are super high quality for some reason, so I couldn't actually import too many at once. I had to import like 5 at a time. This is just because of all of the file sharing services I was using. They wouldn't let me upload anything past 10 megabytes, so I couldn't do like a big dump of 60 locations at a time. I had to manually import 5 of them at a time, and it was super annoying, but whatever, we got through it. I also had to repeat the stage change process for locations like Central Park and Shadowlands that need to spawn in tokens, and Monster Island. Next, I want to talk about some of the more challenging aspects of adapting Marvel Snap to a physical environment. Firstly, there's movement. In the live game, we have the advantage of playing across from one another, but Marvel Snap does some gaming magic so that we're always on the bottom part of that screen. This makes things very difficult in a physical environment or on Tabletop Simulator, because there are locations that refer to left or right, and there are cards that refer to left or right, so you have to be able to determine what is left and what is right. It's also just a bit unintuitive to play the same way that we do on the actual live app, when there's this kind of mirrored effect that happens naturally when you play across from each other. My solution to this was to have each player next to each other, which actually works surprisingly well, by the way. All of the biggest issues of adapting Marvel Snap to Tabletop Simulator is the simultaneous gameplay, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier while we were talking about the prior mod. In the actual game Marvel Snap, you both lock in your turns privately without showing your opponent the number of cards you've put face down, or where you put them. In a physical environment, this is incredibly difficult. More specifically in Tabletop Simulator, what I've done is I've given each player a hidden area that only they can see. They have a private board, and their opponent can't see what cards they're dragging from their hand and putting onto that board. At some point though, you do need to announce, hey, my turn is over. I've laid down the cards that I want to lay down, so let's start flipping cards. This is a solution that works, but it does lead to another problem. The opponent essentially gains information as soon as you announce that you're going to be locking in. You're essentially saying to your opponent, hey, I'm not snapping this turn, and I'm not retreating. I don't see a solution to this problem in a physical environment, but one possible solution could be a timer instead of just locking in your turn. You would essentially automatically lock in your turn when the timer runs out, so maybe you put like a 30-second clock up, and both players are just automatically locked in if they don't finish their turn within those 30 seconds. But because we're playing in a more casual environment, I figured that wasn't really worth implementing. The common courtesy rule we've been using so far on this version of the mod is that you just don't snap after your opponent is locked in, just because it kind of feels weird. But that's like not an official ruling or anything, it's just kind of a common courtesy. There's also a certain degree of required trust, mainly when it comes to movement. Optional movement effects like Nightcrawler and Vision happen before cards are revealed, and they happen in the order of initiative. Meaning if a player moves their cards to New York, the player with initiative is essentially donating information to the opponent. So again, there is a certain degree of trust that needs to be established beforehand, or else you'll never know whether the opponent is using that information that they're gaining or not. On a smaller scale to that, we also have the order of cards that are quote-unquote revealed. The player without initiative gets to quote-unquote react to the opposing player's turn before they reveal their own cards. So you'll never really know whether or not your opponent is modifying their play order, but situations like this are actually pretty rare, and most of the time it's not a huge deal. Like for example, if my friend accidentally flips their Nightcrawler before their Bishop, I know what they wanted to do. They wanted to play Bishop first so that they got the proc from playing Nightcrawler. So usually I just let them rewind time in order to get that proc. Heck, if it's a small enough mistake like that and I'm playing with somebody who hasn't played the game before, I might not even tell them it happened and I'll just give the Bishop +1 power. Especially if they're still trying to learn the game, you don't want to like overwhelm them with information. You can also see your opponent's mouse position even if it's in their hidden area. So if you're being super scummy and you're paying really close attention, you can guess where your opponent's going to be playing. You won't be right 100% of the time because the locations are pretty close to each other, but you can usually have a pretty decent idea. But the table is a private mod and it's only meant for really friendly competition, so I don't see anyone going out of their way to do this because you actually have to really focus to gain that information. So yeah, the setup is a bit janky, but it works. It lets us play with some unreleased cards, and it even lets us play in a first to 10 cube format, which is something we can't do in the live version of the game right now. Will I ever publish this? Probably not. Some of the assets that I'm using on the table aren't created by me. I mean, I made the board and I manually imported all of the assets and I made the card backs, but I didn't create any of the counters that keep track of power cubes or the current turn. I didn't create the table itself. There are some other assets in there that aren't directly created by me, so I don't really want to publish it because I don't want to take credit for anybody else's work. And I don't have the knowledge of how to make those assets on my own, so I'm just going to keep those assets in, the ones that I didn't create, and not publish it. I just wanted an environment to be able to play Marvel Snap with some friends of mine, and I'm an exceptionally impatient person. So yeah, I built Marvel Snap entirely from the ground up in Tabletop Simulator. I hope that earned a like. Thank you for watching, keep being awesome, and I'll catch you later.